The Las Vegas Raiders are one of the hardest teams in the NFL to predict next year, and with somewhat high expectations within the Raiders fan base, today we are going to be discussing the Las Vegas Raiders and why they may potentially be a better team next year than they were last year. Now, there's a lot of sides to the story, so we're going to be breaking this down into a couple different segments. We'll start off with why the Raiders might be a better team next year, then we'll talk about the opposite, why they may not, and at the very end, I'll give you guys my unbiased opinion about the Las Vegas Raiders in a quick synopsis. Now, I want to make something very clear. I am a Raiders fan. However, I'm going to make this as unbiased as I reasonably can, and if any of my bias does show, you guys can roast me in the comment section below. So let's start off by talking about the things I like about this Las Vegas Raiders team. And one of the bigger things I do like about this team is going to be the weapons on this roster. When you look at this receiving core, you're going to have a hard time finding a better trio of wide receivers than what this team already has, unless your team's named is the Chicago Bears or the Cincinnati Bengals or like a couple other teams, but you get my point. Davante Adams, Jakobi Meyers, and Michael Gallup are three really fantastic receivers in the NFL. At certain points last year, Jakobi Meyers was just as good as Davante Adams. Obviously, Davante Adams is like a top 10 wide receiver, and Jakobi Meyers isn't close to that, but you get my point. Meyers looked impressive last year. And then you bring in a guy like Michael Gallup, who I'm a little interested to see what he has left in the tank. Obviously, he's primarily known for his jump ball ability, and I do think if the Raiders do lean into that aspect of his game a little bit more, I think he can be a solid receiver 3. But in all reality, I really don't see a world where he gets a ton of snaps, given the fact that with our first round pick, the Las Vegas Raiders took Brock Bowers. And when you already have a tight end like Michael Mayer, you're primarily probably going to be using Brock Bowers as your receiver 3 / all-around weapon on this offense. I could see a world where they do pull out some 2 tight end sets with Brock Bowers playing on the outside alongside Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers. And while I will make the case that I don't think it was the greatest pick in the first round for the Las Vegas Raiders, I will say adding another weapon like Brock Bowers to add alongside Davante, Jakobi Meyers, and Michael Mayer is really fascinating. Did the Raiders continue to add to what was already a strength? Yes, they kind of did, but I also think like when there's a talent like a Brock Bowers, who easily was a top 10 player in this draft, and you fit him with what pick you did have, I don't really necessarily know if you don't take that pick. Like, I know they had bigger needs for like an offensive tackle or corner, some other positions, but when there is a Brock Bowers available, you just have to take them. Next thing that I think is really good about this Las Vegas Raiders team is going to be their defensive line. As it sits right now, you have guys like Maxx Crosby, Christian Wilkins, and hopefully a guy like Tyree Wilson can continue to take steps forward. Not to mention, you also have somebody in Malcolm Koonce who had 8 sacks last year. I'm not going to make the case that this is the best defensive line in the NFL, but what I will say is if Tyree Wilson can be who we drafted him to be, we're talking about probably the best defensive line in the NFL, if not one of. Maxx Crosby is a defensive player of the year candidate every single year. Christian Wilkins is one of, if not the best defensive tackle in the league. Malcolm Koonce and Tyree Wilson will provide a lot of much needed stability on the other side of the defensive line. And Tyree Wilson has a ton of potential, and if he can just tap into that potential a tad bit with his size, with his frame, with his athleticism, we're talking about somebody who could easily have up to 10 sacks in a season. Unfortunately, last year it really did not show, but I think he has that level of potential in him. I think you're also hoping that some other players like Byron Young, who was your 3rd round pick in last year's draft, could potentially do something in the interior of the defensive line alongside guys like Christian Wilkins and John Jenkins, but we'll just have to wait on that in total. Ultimately though, I think there's a lot of excitement about this team, especially from the personnel standpoint. You have stars in the offense like Brock Bowers and Davante Adams and Colton Miller. Defensively, you have a lot of impressive players like Maxx Crosby, Christian Wilkins, Divine Diablo, Robert Spillane, Jack Jones. And I think with all that excitement, it's going to get the best out of this Raiders team, which is another thing I really like about this franchise. The past 8, 10 plus 15 years now, it's been really hard to get excited about the Raiders team because we knew they were not a very good team. And yes, I don't think there's any Raiders fan, including myself, who thinks this team is going to make a deep run in the playoffs and maybe win a championship. But just the fact that this team is heading in the right direction, I think is generating a ton of excitement from the fan base, which ultimately should lead us to have a very fun next year and next several years. When you bring in a coach who brings the level of excitement, who brings that Raider mentality, you're going to get the excitement from the fan base, which is going to feed into the players playing very well. So those are the things that I like about this team. Again, I like the weapons, I like the defensive line, I think this is a talented roster, and I think the excitement level within the fan base is very fun to watch. But now let's talk about things that we need to look to address in terms of the negatives, certain things that we don't like about this team and what they can improve upon. There's a couple of things that I think are big needs. Number one need this team has to figure out is going to be the long-term answer at quarterback. As it sits right now, you're going to have a quarterback battle between Aiden O'Connell and Gardner Minshew. And while I do expect Minshew to win that battle and be the starter next year, it's very clear and obvious chance that neither one of these guys are going to be the long-term answer. And barring any sort of a miraculous improvement from Aiden O'Connell, you're going to likely have a hard time drafting that top-tier quarterback in next year's draft because you're probably going to be a solid enough team to not have a top 10 pick. Now, what I will say is if this team somehow does end up pulling up into the top 10 by either a trade or just not playing very well, whatever rookie quarterback they do decide to take is going to have a fantastic roster around him to work with as a rookie. But again, because I don't expect this team to be a bottom 10 team in the NFL, it's very likely that you're going to have to trade into the early first round to draft a quarterback, which I felt like you were kind of in a position this year to actually do that. Yes, did I like the Brock Bowers pick? 100%, but when you have a lot of talented quarterbacks still on the board after the first 4 picks, such as a JJ McCarthy, a Bo Nix, and a Michael Penix Jr., I think the Raiders should have definitely looked into potentially trading up to get one of those guys. And while I still think the 2025 quarterback class is full of talent there as well, I will say it kind of does feel like we're wasting another year of a lot of players' primes when we could just take the young quarterback and build with him to become a franchise that can win championships. The one little caveat to that is that I don't think JJ McCarthy, Bo Nix, or Michael Penix Jr. are guys who can carry a team to a Super Bowl unless the team around them is just ridiculously talented, such as potentially the Vikings are. But I think this team is good enough that they could have taken in one of those guys and made them a playoff contender immediately. I will say I think the guys in next year's draft have a ton of upside if they just could prove it out on the field. Then I actually do like what they could bring to the NFL next year. Guys like Quinn Ewers and Shedeur Sanders have so much talent that is just untapped right now, primarily Quinn Ewers. So if they do reach into their bag and become top 5 picks next year, maybe we'll see the Raiders trade in to get those guys. I just think right now it's really hard to buy in on this Raiders team as to being a championship contender when your starting quarterback is Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell. And don't get me wrong, I love Gardner Minshew. I think he could be a fantastic player for this team. But let's be real, he's not going to beat Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or Joe Burrow to get into a playoff spot. Then there are a couple other personnel issues I do have with this roster, and a lot of them are going to primarily consist of some questions within the secondary and a couple offensive line issues I do have. Colton Miller is your left tackle. He's a very good left tackle. There's nothing wrong with him there. Andre James at center is one of my favorite players on this whole team. I think he's a very fantastic player. But I do think there's a couple other questions, primarily with the left guard and the right tackle. Kind of some unproven guys who I think get a little bit too much crap given what we asked them to do. Thayer Munford is technically your starter, and I thought that with the injuries we did have, I thought he played all right. But all in all, I do think the offensive line is sort of an unproven unit that I think could have been really good this year had they went out there and taken a JC Latham, for example. What I will say is by bringing in Jackson Powers Johnson with your second round pick, I think you really boosted up that interior offensive line, which had a lot more questions before the draft. Jackson Powers Johnson to me was an easy first round grade, and for him to fall to the second round, I thought was great value for a guy like Jackson Powers Johnson. But looking into the secondary, you do have a lot of guys who are somewhat unproven, and I think there is questions as to whether or not any of these guys are the guy. And there's not many guys who are considered like the guy. Like for me, the guy is like a Jair Alexander, a Jalen Ramsey, a Trevon Diggs, a Sauce Gardner. I just don't know if Jack Jones or Nate Hobbs or Brandon Fashion could be anything like those guys. I will say I think this secondary is good enough to get the job done with a very good defensive coordinator, but given the fact that I think this team needs a very incredible defense to be successful next year, I just don't know if these guys are good enough to get the job done. And again, when you're a franchise that is looking to try to compete this year and for the future, when you have the pick available to take a guy like a Terran Arnold or a Quinton Mitchell and you decide to go with another weapon, which was already a strength, it is a little bit questionable, to be honest with you. Now again, I don't hate the Brock Bowers pick. I thought there was a lot better value on the board given your positions of need, but Brock Bowers as a prospect and as a talent is fantastic. So it's hard for me to really be too critical of the pick when I love the player. It's just that this team had bigger needs in the secondary and in the offensive line. But regardless, I digress. Another concern I have with this team is going to be who's going to play running back for this team next year. As it sits right now, your technical running back one is going to be between Alexander Mattison and Zamir White. Zamir White last year only had 451 rushing yards on 104 carries, which put him at an average of 4.3. And I really wonder what the game plan was for this Raiders team in this year's draft. Was their plan to keep Josh Jacobs and have Josh Jacobs be the starter next year, but ultimately that did not work out because he left you? Or was the plan that they were going to take a running back in the second round or third round, but there just wasn't anybody available, or maybe there was better available players for the team? I will say Dylan Lobb, getting him late in the draft, I thought was a good value, but I don't know if he's ever going to be your true running back one. I just have a hard time buying into this running back room when it's led by Zamir White and Alexander Mattison. Yes, Mattison had some very good moments for the Vikings, but last year was atrocious for him. And I think Zamir White has some talent, and I'm very excited to see what he can do being the running back 1. But I think when you're trying to convince the fan base that you're going all in and your backcourt is going to be Aiden O'Connell / Gardner Minshew and Zamir White / Alexander Mattison, I'm not saying it's the end of the world to not really have a fantastic run game, but if you're going to have an Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew, I think you have to have a decent run game. Part of the reason why Gardner Minshew was so successful for the Colts last year, and let's be clear, by being successful for Gardner Minshew, I mean having that team be in playoff contention for most of the year, was the fact that they had guys like Zach Moss and Jonathan Taylor who were very good in the run game. Now, I think with our powerful offensive line, I do think Zamir White could be successful, but I really wonder if he can take on the responsibilities of being a true running back 1. But we've talked about the pros, we've talked about the cons. Let me give you guys my unbiased opinion, and again, if I sound biased here, you guys let me know in the comment section below. I don't think I will though. My opinion of the Raiders is this: if things go well and Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell improve tremendously, this could be potentially a 9 to 10 win team that maybe could slip in as the 7th seed in the wild card. However, I just don't see that level of progress on this team given how good the AFC really is. To me, there's too much talent in the AFC for this Raiders team to realistically make the playoffs, and I think they're going to fall just outside of it with probably an 8 to 9 win season. That is my prediction for this team. I think they'll take steps forward in the right direction and potentially finish 3rd or 2nd within the division, but I don't think they're going to be able to beat the better teams when it comes down to it to make the playoffs. Now, with that being said, next year we'll get the franchise quarterback, hopefully, and this issue won't be a reoccurring issue for us. However, I will say I think this team is going to be fun next year. I think they're going to be able to win a lot of games that maybe they shouldn't have won or maybe they should have, and I think they'll look dominant at times, but I don't think it'll be enough to make the playoffs, at least nothing higher than the 7th seed. But if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.